A powder keg has been forming around Iran, and it's just about ready to explode. After weeks of threats, the US is preparing for a fight, and we seem to be hours away from total war between Iran and America. Iran's terrible regime is in panic. America's largest deployment in decades is locked in and ready to strike, and there's nothing that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei or his cronies can do about it. The UK Defense Journal calls what we're now seeing around Iran such a powerful surge of US military activity that it amounts to the largest American buildup anywhere since the Gulf War. The outlet's senior editor, whom it names only as John, has provided as comprehensive a rundown as he can on his Defense Geek X account, and the numbers are insane. On February 16th, the U.S. moved dozens of aerial assets, mostly from the Royal Air Force Lakenheath base, to positions around Iran from which they could attack. A huge assortment of F-35 Lightnings went on the move, with John counting 18 in total heading toward the Middle East. Joining those F-35s were several KC-135T Stratotankers, which are basically aerial refueling stations that allow America's other aerial assets to stay in the air for longer before they have to touch down to refuel. A couple of E-3G Sentry airframes also set out toward Iran, where they will presumably be used for intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. This was all done in one day. February 17th brought with it even more movement. Several dozen F-16C Fighting Falcons were moved as part of the buildup to the Iran operation, along with more Sentry and Stratotanker aircraft. The U.S. has also moved almost a dozen of its KC-46A Pegasus airframes, which are tankers similar to the Stratotanker, along with about half a dozen F-22A Raptors. When you combine all of this with the airframes that the U.S. has already positioned near Iran for its pair of aircraft carrier strike groups, which we'll get into in just a few minutes, you get what may be one of the most impressive examples of aerial might that has ever been assembled, bearing down on Iran in just a couple of days. CNN offers more details, noting that the rapid repositioning of U.S. aerial assets builds on what the U.S. has been doing during the last few weeks. Since January 22nd, the outlet says, the U.S. has moved an RC-135V reconnaissance aircraft to one of its bases in Crete, though that aircraft would have to cross the Mediterranean Sea, Syria, and Iraq at least before it reaches Iran. An F-15 Eagle, an A-10 Warthog attack aircraft, an F-35, and an EA-18G Growler electronic warfare airframe have all been moved to the Azraq base in Jordan. A P-8A Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft is now in position in Bahrain, as is an MQ-4C Triton unmanned aircraft in the United Arab Emirates. And in Saudi Arabia, the U.S. has another Poseidon, an F-16, a Sentry, and an E-11A BACN battlefield communications aircraft at the ready. This is the largest buildup of U.S. military forces in the Middle East in decades, significantly larger than recent operations against Venezuela or even last year's strikes on Iran. Operation Midnight Hammer. Military expert Preston Stewart says in his analysis of what we're seeing near Iran right now. He adds that more may be coming. Right now, the buildup there has not stopped. It is continuing, and there's nothing like this that I can remember. At least nothing like it since the early 2000s, when the U.S. launched its war on terror with the help of its NATO allies in the wake of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. Now, there is one thing missing from this massive deployment. But before we get to that, we've yet to cover the naval aspect of what the U.S. is doing. Far from solely sending airframes to bases around Iran, the U.S. has also built what amounts to a naval blockade in the Persian Gulf region, from which it will be able to unleash even more aerial might against the Iranian regime. As the BBC reported on February 16th, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is a U.S. aircraft carrier, has been confirmed to be sailing in the waters near Iran along with its carrier strike group. That group includes 3 destroyers, with the carrier itself also being home to 90 aircraft, including yet more F-35 fight jets. That is going to be joined by the USS Gerald R. Ford, which France 24 reports was in the Atlantic Ocean en route from the Caribbean to the Middle East on February 19th. That will be yet another carrier strike group in Iran's vicinity in a matter of days, along with the many aircraft that carrier brings into the equation. CNN provides more details with a breakdown of all the naval assets that the U.S. is amassing around Iran and where they are. The USS Abraham Lincoln is in the northern Arabian Sea, where it is apparently accompanied by 4 destroyers, rather than the 3 that the BBC claims. FA-18E-18's Super Hornets, F-35C Lightnings II, EA-18G Grounders, and E-2 Hawkeyes are on that carrier, along with MH-60S and MH-60R Seahawk Navy helicopters. In the Red Sea, the USS Delbert D. Black, which is another destroyer, is on the prow. A pair of literal combat ships is in the Persian Gulf region, and the U.S. has sent 2 destroyers and another literal combat ship to the Strait of Hormuz. As for the USS Gerald R. Ford, it's bringing 3 more destroyers to the region, along with its fleet of Fa-18E Super Hornets, E-2 Hawkeyes, EA-18G Growlers, and the C-2A Greyhound cargo aircraft to Iran. Like the USS Abraham Lincoln, USS Gerald R. Ford also has Seahawk Navy helicopters. Phew. So when we said this was a massive military buildup, that's starting to feel like an understatement. This doesn't feel like an attempt to project power by the US and the Trump administration. What we're seeing here is a country that is getting ready for a serious fight. So stick with us until later in the video as we'll reveal what that fight could mean for the US. The only thing missing from this massive deployment is highlighted by Stewart. In making a comparison to the War on Terror, he says one notable piece that's missing, if we're going to make that comparison from now to 2003, is the boots on the ground. There's nowhere near the same quantity of U.S. military Marines and soldiers on the ground that would take part in any sort of land invasion of Iran. Stewart is right. And no U.S. troops being near Iran should come as a surprise. Even as it has volleyed threats Iran's way, the U.S. has always been wary of committing any sort of ground force to a war with Iran. Back in the summer of 2025, when the U.S. launched Operation Midnight Hammer against Iran's nuclear facilities, Vice President J.D. Vance claimed that America's war was with Iran's nuclear program and not Iran itself. He added that the U.S. had no interest in boots on the ground in Iran due to this, and it had instead used Operation Midnight Hammer to set the stage for nuclear talks to come. Those talks are happening right now, and their direction is influencing the U.S. military build. Before we get to those talks, Vance's 2025 claims have been reiterated by U.S. Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, who spoke to a rally of tens of thousands of Iranians to show support for their desire to topple Khamenei's regime. However, Pompeo also made it clear the U.S. wouldn't be sending cash or soldiers to Iran itself. Pompeo said that the proposed path for change in Iran does not ask for the United States to put soldiers on the ground. Well, the message seems pretty clear. No soldiers. Whether that could change or not remains to be seen, as the U.S. getting bogged down in a protracted war with Iran is what is clearly going to happen if America's initial strategy of shattering Iran's regime with an aerial blitz doesn't work. For its part, Iran is sitting back idly while waiting to see what the U.S. does next. It's preparing too. But quick side note, you're watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to ensure you keep seeing our videos. As for Iran, CNN reports that the country is fortifying ahead of what it believes is an imminent aerial blitz by the U.S. Several of the country's nuclear facilities, some of which would have been targeted by Operation Midnight Hammer in 2025, are being prepared for the future. Iran is covering those sites with concrete and soil, suggesting that it's trying to build shields of some sort to stop America's bombs and missiles from doing massive amounts of damage. For instance, the Tarlagan 2 facility, which is about 18 miles southeast of the Iranian capital of Tehran, has been covered with a sarcophagus of concrete and is now being covered with soil. That will make it harder to hit unless the U.S. has precise coordinates, and the concrete might be enough to stop all but the most powerful of America's bunker-busting bombs. On the offensive front, the Wall Street Journal said on February 18th that Iran's regime is deploying forces throughout the country and trying to disperse decision-making authority as much as possible, which will allow it to keep its military running even if the U.S. scores hits against isolated commanders. Naval units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, have also been deployed to the Strait of Hormuz, though it remains to be seen if the IRGC has access to any naval assets that could present real threats to the warship that the U.S. has sent to that same strait. Add all of this to an estimated stockpile of 2,000 ballistic missiles, and Iran does have some firepower it can use as a threat if nuclear talks break down. Iran's problem is twofold. The U.S. has far more firepower, and it seems to be on the verge of a strike. For the latter of those issues, the U.S. striking as quickly as possible reduces the amount of time that Iran has to prepare for war. And a rapid American strike may actually be on the cards, as there are rumors that the U.S. buildup could culminate in the first shot of the upcoming war as early as February 21st. That's according to CNN, which says that the White House has already been briefed that the U.S. military may be ready to carry out a strike as early as this weekend, especially following the buildup of aerial and naval assets that we've seen over the past couple of days. There is, of course, only one man who can make the decision about whether or not the U.S. strikes. That man is U.S. President Donald Trump, and he has a lot to think about before he gives the okay, as you'll find out if you stick with us for a few more minutes. Much of what happens during the coming weekend will be determined by the progress, or lack thereof, that is made in the ongoing nuclear talks the U.S. is holding with Iran. Negotiators from both sides communicated for over 3 hours on February 17th during indirect talks in Geneva, though nothing appears to have come from those talks. According to the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt, Iran is expected to provide more details about its negotiating position in the next couple of weeks. That may not be seen as enough, though Leavitt also stressed that "I'm not going to set deadlines on behalf of the President of the United States," and that diplomacy is still Trump's first option when referring to the possibility of a weekend strike. In short, this all means that the U.S. is ready to go, but Trump might not be. Iran also seems to think that it has more time to hash out a nuclear deal with the U.S. than CNN is implying. On February the 17th, BBC reported that Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that the Geneva talks have laid down the guiding principles needed to resolve the issues holding up the nuclear deal, though he also added that more work needs to be done even if progress was made. The question now seems to be whether the U.S. views the talks that have already happened as enough to convince it that Iran is going to come around on a version of the nuclear deal that is acceptable to the U.S. After all, it's possible that Iran is just trying to buy itself more time by stringing America's negotiators along. Time is like gold dust to Iran right now, as every day it has is a day that it can spend fortifying and shuffling assets around. Preston Stewart certainly seems to think that the U.S. likely has the prevailing opinion that the nuclear talks are going nowhere. What we've heard most recently is that the two sides have agreed to keep talking, which is kind of diplomatic talk for no progress made. Let's see if we can get closer next time, Stewart says. He adds, and when you look at the list of demands from the United States and what Iran has said they are or not willing to talk about again, it's just hard to see how there's any room for progress there. If Stewart is right, then the massive military buildup around Iran could become the starting point for a full-blown war very soon. Whether it's this weekend or not depends on something that we mentioned earlier. All the U.S. knows that it has the firepower to cause serious problems for Iran. Trump has to weigh up his options because there is great potential for what he and his administration hope would be a rapid destruction of Iran's regime to turn into a protracted war that affects the entire Middle East. Stewart says that the U.S. is still trying to figure out what its endgame is ultimately going to be in Iran. Does it just want to get the nuclear deal done? What does the U.S. intend to end the Khamenei regime, bringing about the wholesale change to Iran that over 36,500 protesters have died for? The answers to these questions will inform Trump's decision, with the U.S. having to essentially sort out the pros and cons of starting the war before it does anything. If the U.S. chooses to go ahead, what may happen over the weekend could be just the beginning of a multi-week campaign designed to cripple Iran's regime, according to the Times of Israel sources. Other sources quoted by the Times of Israel say that there is 90% chance we see kinetic action in the next few weeks. If that happens, one of the pros that Trump can kick off, at least in terms of the strength of the force levied against Iran, seems to be that the U.S. would have Israel's support. According to Al Jazeera, Israel's President Benjamin Netanyahu considers himself aligned with the U.S. on a strategy of exerting maximum pressure on Iran. Netanyahu has also supposedly told Trump that any nuclear deal that is signed will be futile, which suggests that Israel is ready to fight, perhaps even more so than the U.S. That at least means that the U.S. has an ally, so it's not doing everything itself. And according to a February 15th article published by the Atlantic Council, there are several more reasons why Trump should pull the trigger on using the U.S. military in Iraq. Perhaps chief among them is that the Khamenei regime is at its weakest it has been in decades, which means that the U.S. has a better chance to institute change in Iran than it has had since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. How much sway that particular reason will have on Trump depends on how serious he is about deposing the current regime versus getting his nuclear deal over the line. The moral imperative created by the brutal Iranian regime's crackdown on the protests that we mentioned earlier is another reason for giving the go-ahead that feeds into the U regime changing. The Atlantic Council also suggests that the U.S. might have to attack just for credibility's sake, especially if its recent military buildup doesn't bring about the desired outcome from nuclear talks. Iran's massive energy reserves and their potential integration into Western markets, if regime change is brought about, is another item in the pro column, as in the U.S. giving itself skin in the Iranian regime and thus a stronger position in the Middle East, if it wins the war. And of course, the toppling of the Khamenei regime could put the entire issue of the Iranian nuclear weapons program to bed. That seems like an overwhelming number of positives for the U.S. choosing to go to war. And maybe they will be enough. However, several other outlets have noted that there is a certain element of risk attached to what the U.S. is planning to do. As the national interest points out, failure by the U.S. to achieve an overwhelming and fast victory with its aerial and naval assets could result in a much longer war that spirals out of America's control. Iran may have the ability to extend the conflict, actually if it deploys an asymmetric strategy that relies on using drones and protecting itself against the worst of the American bombardment. And if the U.S. goal is to force regime change rather than use gunboat diplomacy to get what it wants out of a military deal, then that could be a problem. Crucially, if Iranian leaders conclude that this is Washington's ultimate objective, they are far more likely to approach any confrontation as a fight for survival, rather than a limited exchange akin to the 12-day war the national interest sets. In other words, rather than merely sitting there and taking it before firing off a response against the American base once the U.S. is done, Iran would be a lot more proactive in both its defense and offense, which again extends the duration of the war. Other regional powers are very aware of the escalation that this could lead to. Iran International says that the likes of Oman, Qatar, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey have all moved toward diplomacy in the budding conflict and have all warned against escalation and the damage that it could do in the Middle East. Trump also has to consider what that escalation would mean for the U.S. and his administration's approval ratings. Launching bombs and missiles at Iran from fighter jets is one thing. Getting locked into a massive war that could force boots to be placed on the ground, even if that's not what Trump wants, is quite another. The risks that are clearly inherent in starting a war with Iran are likely the reasons why Trump has yet to pull the trigger. Right now, the U.S. seems to be a step or two ahead of mere posturing, but it hasn't yet crossed the line into outright conflict. Maybe nuclear talks will deliver the results that America wants, leading to tensions simmering back down. But if they don't, Iran may face the Trump administration's wrath for refusing to play ball as quickly as the U.S. president wants. In that scenario, the U.S. is ready to strike by February the 21st. Time will tell if Iran crumbles or if it has had enough time to turn what could be a flash war into a more protracted and damaging conflict. One person who will be watching what is going on in Iran right now with great interest is Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Why? Well, Putin knows that the collapse of the Khamenei regime will ruin any chances that Russia has of being an effective geopolitical player in the Middle East region. Losing Iran might even cripple Putin's own regime, as you'll discover if you check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe for more in-depth analysis of what is happening in the world of war.